I'm Bob Newton. I'm the interim director of the Church in the 21st Century Center. This is my third interim directorship, and I'm also special assistant to Father Leahy. I'd like to welcome you to the second event in this semester's program, centered around the theme, Grace and Commitment, and the focus is on the vocations of laity, the ordained, and religious. I'd like to thank Tom Wall and the library staff for making this very attractive space available to us. Some of you were here last year when Tom O'Connor talked about his book, 2 Centuries of Faith. Before Karen introduces our presenters, I would like to do 3 things. I'd like to draw your attention to something you've already received. If you haven't received it, we have additional copies. And right in the center, you find the what's called C21 Update, which is all of the programs that we're sponsoring and co-sponsoring through the fall semester. Secondly, I'd like to suggest that you bookmark the center website for a very interesting and constantly changing variety of resources. It's intuitive, so it's just bc.edu/church21. And you'll find Sister Helen Prejean, who spoke to 1,000 people over at County Forum about 10 days ago. You'll find a video of her very dramatic presentation. She's a real spellbinder. You'll find Father Leahy's story about himself, his Iowa roots, how he became a Jesuit, what he thinks about being the president of Boston College. You'll find Mark Herzlich, who talks about what his tragic bout with cancer meant to him last year and what lessons he learned from. So there's lots of interesting stuff, and it's always changing. So check that edu/church21. And the final thing I'm going to do is congratulate Tim Muldoon and Cynthia Dabrowski for their creativity and hard work in editing the 10th volume of the Church in the 21st Century series. Again, welcome, and let me introduce Karen Kiefer, the Assistant Director of the Church in the 21st Century Center.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's so much fun to see so many familiar faces come together for lunch. We began this luncheon model back in January, and it seemed to work, so I'm glad we can keep it going. I also want to express thank yous to the staff at the O'Neill Library, and also we worked in great partnership with the Office of Human Resources, and they've just been great in trying to get the word out about this event. So today, we have marriage on the menu, which should be a whole lot of fun. I did a small sampling with a few of you that came into the room, 12 to be exact. I asked you respectfully how many years you've been married. 12 people, 326 years collectively. So that's a lot of marriage, and it's a lot of commitment. But I think it speaks to the vocation of marriage and to the interest in any of our vocations that we just want to keep growing and want to continue to learn more. And if you read Tim and Cindy's collection of essays, there's 14 essays in there by 14 different authors. It really will not only enlighten you and inspire you, but it will change your paradigm, and that can be a good thing. Today we're going to talk about the 5 hopes and challenges of marriage today. And it's obviously celebrating our official book launch for Love One Another, Catholic Reflections on How to Sustain Marriage Today. And when I was thinking about this event, and I was thinking about a Catholic reflection on marriage, I kind of take myself back to when I was about 4 years old, back in the 1960s, the days where your parents told you things and you never really questioned them. So I'll never forget the day that my mother said to me that not only was she married to my father, but she was married to God. And I remember thinking, ooh, does Dad know? And then, shortly after, we were at my cousin's christening. I was in Dorchester. It was St. Ambrose Parish. The christening came and went. We're gathering outside of the church. I can remember this like it was yesterday. And she pulled me over and she said, Karen, I want you to meet someone special. This is Father, I think it was O'Brien. And he's a special man in my life. He's the priest who married me. And I thought, oh, she's married to him too? And it's so funny because back then, you're so naive and you don't ask any questions. And now I look back and I think, gosh, that was such a beautiful reflection of the way my mother viewed her marriage to my father, and that God was so involved in that, and that it really was like a holy trinity. And you know, that works for me. So anyway, as we continue on, I hope that our discussions this afternoon will be as enlightening and as fruitful. I'd like to introduce Tim and Cindy. The good news is they have BC in their blood. Tim is not only a graduate of Boston College, but he teaches here in the honors program. He works here in mission and ministry. He married his wife, Sue, who went here, and they have 2 gorgeous daughters. When he's not teaching, he's writing, and he's penned a lot of books, and one of his books is actually Longing to Love, and also Seeds of Hope, Young Adults in the Catholic Church in the United States. And when he's not reading, and he's not writing, and he's not teaching, he's a hugely active member at our parish back in Wayland. So we're really excited to have him on board today. And Cindy Dabrowski has more than 20 years of experience in nonprofit management and in ministry. She also has worked at the national level. Her experience includes organizational leadership, policy development, spiritual direction, advocacy, mission. She is also, in her spare time, the director of mission and values at the Uville Senior Care Center in Lowell. So she too is married to David and has been married for 30 years and has 3 beautiful daughters. The daughter thing must be a theme because I have 4. But anyway, we are so pleased to have them here today. They're both going to speak, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. Tim?
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Bob, for those generous introductions. I want to do a couple things. First, tell a very brief story about how the book came to be, and then say a little bit of something of the backdrop for why this is an interesting topic that we addressed, and then I'll turn it over to Cindy. So here's the nutshell version. One day, Cindy calls me and says, what do you think about doing a thing on marriage? And at the time, I was, in fact, directing the Church in the 21st Century Center, and I said to myself, well, this is an obvious fit. This is a center that's interested in questions about where the church is today, and certainly with an issue like marriage. It's at the interface of a couple of the focal issues, one of which is sexuality in Catholic tradition, and the other of which is young adults in Catholic tradition. And it doesn't take too long a stretch of the imagination to say, well, many people who are getting married today, at least among Catholics, are young adults, so okay, there's a good fit. We met, we had a very good conversation, we brought others into that conversation, and we named the people that we thought could help us tell a story about marriage. And specifically, it's a story that's not necessarily the same as what you're going to be finding today in the media or just among pundits. We wanted to tell something of a deeper story, a richer story, and I think I would describe it with just an observation, and it's this one. It's remarkable that 2 human beings can decide to share a life together. It's remarkable. Now, I say that because we tend to default to the bad news about how marriage has changed and how it's not what it used to be and how the expectations have really been challenged in recent years. And even the definition of marriage has changed in recent years. And we wanted to not dive into that thicket. That was not our objective in this book. Again, we wanted to tell a deeper story and a richer story. And again, it's predicated on that observation that it's remarkable that 2 human beings can pledge to live a life together. That's a remarkable thing. If you step back from it and think about that, that's truly a remarkable observation. And so the next observation was, well, surely Catholic tradition within which we both situate ourselves, surely Catholic tradition has something to say about that. Now, there's a history, of course, and there's a theology, and there's canon law and all the rest. But perhaps even more basically, there are certainly ways that people who come from the Catholic tradition can speak from their experience as married people to others who are either thinking about marriage or who are married today, and draw from that tradition in a rich way to shed light on and what that might mean. So the last brief thing I'll say before I turn it over to Cindy is this. One thing that makes this book, or made this book, such a fascinating process is that all of the contributors themselves spoke from a lot of experience of marriage. So in my case, my wife and I have been married for 17 years. Cindy's 31 with her husband. Every one of the contributors is a married person, and even if you look historically at that, that's unusual. It was very often treated by priests and religious. So we had a group of people that wanted to reflect on the question, well, how can we help people to think about sustaining marriage given the circumstances that we're in? That's what really was motivating this book.
Yeah. And a lot of the people that we brought in to talk about this were actually working in the field of marriage preparation, marriage ministry, or theologians who had been reflecting on what Catholic marriage means today. We do have a really rich history and tradition of Catholic marriage, but as you all know, things have changed. So we wanted to see, what does that mean today? What are we really talking about? Because marriage isn't just an expectation for people anymore. It's something that they consciously decide, that they're choosing to live this particular vocation. And we really looked at it, this is a vocation within the church. To live in this particular consecrated life, because that's what it is. In the words of Rick Gallardi's, it's a daring promise. We're promising ourselves to live together and jumping off into this unknown future. So, and a lot of young people today are not really thinking that they're going to get married, or at least not right away, and it's off somewhere in the vague distance. But there are a lot of things that we can still say about that. Certainly that a lot of people would like to be married, and maybe perhaps the circumstances just aren't right. And also that people who have been married for a long time still have a lot to teach us about what that means. And at various stages of life and relationships, there's always something more that we can learn, and then we learn from each other. So that was kind of where we went, and wanted to offer these reflections also in terms of the Bishop's National Pastoral Initiative on Marriage. The Bishop spent about 5 or 6 years trying to get a lot of information from people who were married, people who were reflecting on marriage, social scientists, theologians, married couples, divorced couples of all ages, and to see what that really meant. So this is situated within that whole reflection that is going on within the Catholic Church today about marriage.
So a historical observation is warranted here. Based on Karen's very unscientific survey, we have a large group of people here who themselves have experience of marriage, all right? And I'm just looking around the room and saying, okay, that's there are certain presuppositions. Let's talk about the ways that people in this country thought about marriage a generation ago. We'll just leave it vague, for safety's sake. And let's just ask ourselves, how many of those presuppositions about marriage a generation ago still prevail today? Or to ask it in a more practical way, those of you that have adult children, how many, don't raise your hands, but how many of you would say that your children approach questions about marriage or even about relationships in the same ways that you did when you were their age? I think chances are most people would say there's a big difference. There's a huge difference. The social structures that supported, and maybe that's not the best word, but that led people into married life for many generations in this country and in others, those social structures have changed a great deal. Marriage is no longer the same kind of obvious decision that I suspect for many people was an obvious decision. Now, one just quick datum to support that observation: the average age of people entering marriage has gone up significantly over the last generation. From about maybe 23, 22 once upon a time to now something like 27, 26, male, female. Okay, so the median age has risen, which means that people are deferring getting married. We could talk about economic factors. We can talk about geographic factors, and we won't bore you with all of those details, but I just want to make the observation that marriage is different today. But there's a downside, there's an upside. I want to focus on the upside. The upside to me is this. When young people enter marriage, and I say this, by the way, as somebody who is taught courses on marriage, to people, young people who think about this. Those who do enter married life, many of those that enter married life, but not necessarily everybody, but many enter it with eyes wide open. They understand this is not a guarantee. They know the statistics. Everybody, at least among the students that I've taught, knows someone that's been touched by divorce, and very often a difficult divorce. Okay, again, we don't need to rehearse the statistics. My stress here is that those that do enter with eyes wide open very often are disposed to work at and create better marriages than there may once have been. What do I mean by that? I just mean that they understand that this is something that they are going to have to do in a pioneering sort of way. They're not going to rely on the social supports that once prevailed in American society, and heck, even within the church itself. They're not going to rely on those social supports. Many young couples report feeling that they are having to sort of figure it out as they go, write a script, even as they are acting out the play. There are downsides, but again, the upside is that there's an intentionality. There's an intentionality to entering marriage that I think was not always the case. Those of you that are young, okay, those of you that are maybe looking forward to a future of wanting to be married, might say to yourself that, okay, I don't necessarily assume that my partner is going to have the same full understanding of marriage that I do. I suspect that you realize that you're going to be wanting resources, to learn what makes a marriage work. And there's a lot of research. There's a lot of understanding of that. So even the fact that marriage is an object of study is itself, I think, a hopeful sign.
And I think part of the issue is that when people enter marriage today, they're entering with, as Tim said, different expectations and different family experiences, and that's not something that we can assume that they're always going to be able to understand from each other. They're not entering it with the same cultural assumptions. You may have one spouse who is a child of divorce and another who isn't. Well, they're entering in with very different assumptions, feelings, and experiences of what a marriage looks like. And those are things that are going to need to be negotiated during their marriage. There may be somebody who has, if you have different educational levels. In the past, most people who married did have the same educational level, and probably now it's probably being more similar because there is a greater cultural divide. People who are getting married, who are college educated, have a much more significant chance of having happy, successful marriages, whether that's partly due to an increased economic status or to, again, the formation experience that happens in college for young adults. There's a lot of different information about that. But I think what we have to understand is that there are so many different experiences of marriage and family that people have been growing up with. Most young people who are marrying today are the children of divorce. There's a significant percentage of that. That changes a lot of what we need to teach about marriage, what we need to learn about marriage, and how we're going to approach what this means for us.
So I would propose that the primary contribution that Catholic tradition writ large can offer to those who are thinking about marriage, it's not, in my mind, it's not rocket science. It's not something that's arcane or reachable only by theologians. It's basically the observation that marriage, or let's even back it up a half step and say, living with another human being and seeking to share a life, which is how we tend to describe marriage, that's a constant act of faith in the other. That's a constant act of faith. So today is different from yesterday. We got along yesterday. We're fighting today. Okay, there's an act of faith, and anybody who's married knows this. That there are going to be up times, there are going to be down times. What I think Catholic tradition offers to reflection on marriage is the idea that married life is itself an act of faith. And so to take that a step further, there is a kind of spirituality, not a kind of spirituality, there is a spirituality that goes along with that. What do I mean by this? I mean that if we can describe what Jesus taught as at least tending toward what we picked as the title of the book, okay, love one another, right? This being one of the later commands that Jesus gives to the disciples. Love one another as I have loved you. Okay, this is my command. All right, from John's Gospel. If we can take that idea and say that that loving another person requires a way of living in the world. In other words, it's a series of decisions, but it's also a series of ways of seeking to engage with the other. If we can describe it that way, then we can say, well, yeah, surely Catholic tradition has something to say about that. How is it that in our tradition we speak of what it means to love another, to love another person, to actually go about the daily work? And we all know what daily work looks like. I'm talking about the actual, cleaning up after each other and choosing a home to live in and what city and what jobs and what to do with kids. I mean, the ordinary work. What that does is it puts all of that, and here I'm going to wax theological for a half step. I won't do it for a long time. But all of that put together starts to look like a way of thinking eschatologically. Big fancy word. What do I mean? That all of this has ultimate meaning. That in fact, when I am doing the dishes, that has ultimate meaning. When I am taking out the trash, that has ultimate meaning. When I am, disciplining my children, that has ultimate meaning. All of those things somehow are oriented towards this thing that she and I are striving toward together. That's a spirituality. I mean, that's something that I think our tradition offers to a great extent.
And I think one of the things that we talk about is we tend to think of sacred sometimes as out there somewhere. And really what we're essentially saying is that the daily life of marriage, the life that you live in common with your spouse, in and of itself is holy. When you add in the relationships that flow out of that, your relationships with your family, with your coworkers, with your perhaps members of your neighborhood, your town, the soccer team, whatever else you have, all those relationships are signs of God's love as well, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on what the intimacy of the relationships are. But also the raising of children within that relationship, that is the springboard for new life, regeneration, and all of those have profound implications for our own relationship with God. And part of what we're looking at in marriage today is this idea that you're finding a soulmate, and whether or not that's a really good way to look at it without tending to take into account all the messiness and the times that you really just need to say, I made this promise, I'm going to live up to it. And to say that that you have an emotional best friend, or the Anam Cara in the Irish tradition. This is something that we're talking, it's a fundamental shift in how we're looking at marriage and saying, we know that this is a sacred vocation. Our lives together, in all their messiness, are holy. And the rituals that we have as a married couple, as parents of children, as members of an extended family, whether it's by blood or by choice, those things are where we live out our relationship with God. And it's something very concrete and very profound, and something that we need to pay attention to recognize those little glimmers of light in our lives where God is truly present to us.
This theme is touched on in a couple of the essays that are in the book, namely this kind of social dimension. Cindy was talking about this embeddedness in different communities and structures within the course of a marriage, and here's where I think again the way that the church has approached the question of marriage starts to look a little different than what is emerging as a more conventional kind of mainstream way to look at it in the American context. What do I mean by this? I mean that it's absolutely irretrievable. I mean, or it's absolutely clear in the Catholic tradition that marriage has always been seen as both something that these two people do, that they make a choice for each other, and at the same time, it has an impact, and a profound impact, on the wider community. In fact, we don't even say communities, plural. We've got, I think, a tendency, I don't want to write this too large, but I think we've got a tendency in the American context to think of marriage as a private decision. This is something that these two people can do, and we don't want to put a lot of rules, on that. Again, Catholic tradition has always looked at marriage in terms of these larger social dynamics. And to me, there's a practical side to this. I could give you the history. I could tell you all about that. But what I'm interested in right now is that there's an implication for thinking of marriage with this larger social meaning. I think of the way that the essay by David McCarthy, for example, gets at this question in the book. He by the way, is a theologian himself, moral theologian, who wrote a very good book called Sex and Love in the Home, in which he talks about, he uses this word habitat, which I find a very engaging way to think about this. You never marry as an isolated couple. You never do. There's always spillover, into the immediate family. There's always spillover into the community. There's always spillover into certainly, child, their friends, their school, all these networks. All of these things are going to be affected, and so I think if there's a genius that's attached to this, sometimes there's a kind of a big stick that's attached to this. But I want to talk about the genius that's attached to this. The genius is that communities sustain marriages. Yes, couples sustain marriages, but communities sustain marriages. What does this mean? This means that you can do a lot to analyze the state of marriage in our country and in any country by looking not just at individual, expectations or individual choices or individual actions. You can do a lot by looking at the answer to the question, how are marriages sustained by these social structures? What do I mean by social structures? For example, a parish. A parish can say, we think marriage is good because, in our tradition it's a sacrament. It's about, providing a stable home for children, whatever you want to say about it. But it's a social structure. It's a community of people that says, we value this. In the absence of community support, and I think there's evidence to bear this out, in the absence of community support, marriages are more fragile. Why? Because life is hard. Life is hard. We all know this, that there are things that get in the way of making any shared life an easy series of yeses. There are always things that are going to make things start to look difficult. I'm talking about the hard decisions. Someone's lost a job. We don't have enough money. Our kid is fill in the blank. Okay, those can torpedo married life. If there's a community that says, we will love you, we will support you, we will help you through this, and you will know a deeper and more lasting joy on the other side of this, that's significant. That is significant. I'm trying to suggest, with a couple of the authors in this volume, that we do a disservice if we don't responsibly treat that larger social question, i.e., how is it that our social structures enhance the way that married people approach what they see themselves doing with each other?
And a lot of what happened with marriage in the past, particularly with our immigrant population, was that you knew your spouse from the same parish, you had the same ethnic background, you got married, you lived close by, and you had an automatic built-in support system. Well, we are creating our own support systems as we go along, and sometimes our communities are scattered across the world. And if we're talking about a lot of what is parish-based support, we need to think beyond the geographical boundaries of the parish, because that's not always practical for people who are coming into our churches. So what if we have somebody who comes back and gets married within our parish? They grew up in the parish. They have moved away. They've gone to college in another state. They're just coming back to where they grew up to get married. Then what? Their parents may be still living there. What happens to that couple when they're going to wherever they've decided to move? What support will they then have from a spiritual point of view? They may have to go out and create that for themselves or find another parish. Well, what can we do to help that? Maybe we say, okay, you're living here, there's this parish around, let's make a connection there. Send them to their website, have somebody from the parish call the couple when they get back, when they've actually moved there, and start making those connections in creative ways. And I think that what we're talking about, in order to create these kinds of communities that will support marriages and families, we need to be intentional about it, we need to be creative about it, and we need to think outside the models that we've already experienced, because that's not the world we're living in now.
If there's a practical side to this, and we're gonna move to identifying some takeaways. We want to leave some time for conversation, some questions. So have them ready. We'll move towards those in just a couple minutes. If there's a practical side to this, I think there are many practical sides, but I'll suggest one in particular. What Cindy I think is referring to is this idea that I was kind of alluding to at the beginning of my remarks, namely that the situation has changed a great deal. Okay, so social structures are different. The way we approach parishes is different. The way we approach marriage is different. The way we think about all these things has changed a good deal in recent years. If it is true that social, let me not say it that way, that communities help sustain marriage, if that much is true, then a critical question becomes, all right, if I am a young person and I'm thinking about marrying someone, this person that I love, what should I expect? What should I do to inoculate us against these currents that seem to fragment people and create discord within marriages? What can I do? Well, one compelling answer, it's not the only answer, so I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it is, but one compelling answer that is abundantly clear to me by looking at the data, and it's data, by the way, that comes not just from those who are within the church. I think this is corroborated by national data. Yeah. One of those is that a shared prayer life is a good thing. A shared prayer life. So, we know that couples that do have a robust commitment to shared spirituality tend to have better marriages. And okay, that's fine. I suppose you could say rah rah us. That's great. That's not my point. My point is to underscore that what that does is, I think, two things. First, it tends to embed people in communities that matter. In other words, they're not communities that are just gathered for some temporary interest, like the Patriots game. Okay, faith communities tend to, hopefully, knock on wood, have roots that are a little bit deeper. Okay, and tend to be sustaining communities that are a little bit deeper. So I think that's one factor. But the other factor is what I was trying to allude to earlier, namely that a shared spirituality. And by the way, let me just add something in parentheses before I finish this thought. This does not in every case mean the same practice of the same religious tradition. Okay, there's a very interesting body of work. Lee Williams in particular points to it among interfaith couples, and Bonnie Mack in our volume points to it among interchurch couples. So I'm not necessarily talking about the same religious tradition, although there's more to be said. Let me just get back to the original thought. What a shared spirituality does, in addition to embedding a couple in a community, is that it does remind them that it's a pilgrimage. It's a pilgrimage. And what I mean by pilgrimage is that there's an understanding that there is something more that's at stake than just what is going on right now. I would describe the spiritual life as an attempt to see the now as being related to the ultimate, the eternal. And so if I see the now maybe the now is we're going through a hard time. The ultimate might be something like, but that happens in a marriage. Let's continue to work through it. Let's continue to stay together as friends through this process until we emerge on the other side of it. Okay, I think that's what a shared spirituality can do. So, if my students ask me, what would you recommend for married people? I'd say, quite simply, learn how to pray. Learn how to pray.
And I think recognizing that you may have very different ideas on what your own spirituality, where you find God in your life. I know that's something that I found personally, is that when you look at that, sometimes that takes some negotiation and saying, okay, and opening yourself up to that really deep intimacy, saying, where do I find God? And sometimes that's hard for people to do, to really express that, to be able to find that, and to be able to share that once they've been able to name it for themselves. And I think that's one of the things that if you have that bond, that commitment, that you say, our life together is going to grow deeper and richer and fuller as we move on. And the idea of pilgrimage is good, but also I think we have to take on the idea of it's not all something out there. It's something that happens within us together, in our life together, in our home together, and how we then go forth from that core, that central part of our being, where we are together.
It's a compelling way to even think about what a faith community can be doing together. I mean, both in the context of marriage, but even more broadly, that we are, sharing this attempt to learn how to love. I mean, again, what makes marriage a sacrament within Catholic tradition, among other things, this isn't the only reason, but one of the things that makes it a sacrament within Catholic tradition is that it is seen as having significance for the whole church.
Right.
Why? Because it's a place where we practice what it means to love the way Jesus did. Okay, that's one way to render it. So it's not a bad way to think about the larger task of Christian living, of discipleship even. And in that respect, the word vocation has become, I think, very common to use in reference to marriage. That we don't see vocation as strictly something that is reserved for priests and nuns. As once upon a time, vocation is the living out of the Christian call. Marriage can be one way that we can do that. We want to leave some time for some Q&A. May I propose that we take exactly 1 minute, talk to somebody. I don't want to throw everybody on the spot, but digest. But I want to create some chance for conversation, and we'll take some questions and ask you to share your thoughts. And somebody, Karen, will have a microphone so we can circulate. So take a minute, and then we'll open it up. Give her just a second. They can't hear otherwise.
You didn't really touch on it, but you mentioned about interfaith marriage, and and I was speaking with one of my coworkers here because we both grew up in the 50s and the 60s, where no one, very rarely, married outside their faith.
Right.
In strong Catholic families, you thought somebody had died if one of their kids came home and said they were marrying somebody of a different religious faith. And we were just, tossing around. We were wondering if during that time also divorce was not common in the 50s and the 60s. If that could have been the start of the downfall of some of the marriages when people just started getting away from their religious upbringing, and because of the differences, maybe that could have been brought on some divorces or whatever.
I think there are a lot of cultural factors that have gone into it. One was the development of the birth control pill, where sexuality became divorced from the act of marriage. So, and there, certainly the things that happened within the 60s and before that too, but also I think it just ended up being that there were a number of cultural factors like that where the families perhaps grew and moved on and grew out of the enclave, if you will, where they lived, not necessarily in connection with another type of church, even of, we look at your borders defined by what parish you're in, not by what your neighborhood is. For people to expand beyond that kind of thinking, I think it's a natural progression, along with a lot of other things that were going on. The Vietnam War, all of those types of things had an effect on it.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I think that the crux of the problem is having God in your life, and the confusion of that. And my sense, I'm a little older. I was instilled, this is what you do, in that sense of doing or else. The or else was a real problem. But over time, that or else has gone away. So now it's my own decision, and I've made a lot of decisions.
Right.
And I see the struggle, as we all know, God has been moved out of the society, is my perspective. And it's up to the people to bring it back. So anyways, getting to the question, I see the churches having the turmoil. And if they can't come united, that they have the same God, then that strife just goes on and on and on. And that's where the difficulty is. So until the entity of the church marries one another, in the sense that we're on the same path and create ecumenicalness, there's a real problem. And that model is not modeled well, as far as I'm concerned, and as a result, we have all that strife.
It's an interesting observation. What I'm thinking of, or what I was thinking of as you were speaking, was the fact that one of the key texts that shaped early Christian reflection on marriage was the text from Ephesians 5 that makes this link between Christ and the church as an analogy for marriage. The echo, I suppose you could say, is from the Old Testament notion of God. And I'm thinking the book of Hosea, for example, this image that marriage becomes a prophetic symbol, something like that, something that has an impact on the way that we think of these larger questions. So that's not a bad point of departure, and this relates to the earlier question, I think, as well. If it's possible, this is stating it somewhat simplistically, but if it's possible for a Catholic and a Jew to live out a holy marriage, that should tell us something. That has implications for the way we think about God. It has implications for the way that we think about worship, liturgy, our similarities and differences, in those traditions. I mean, that's an important observation. What is in some ways unfortunate, but in other ways a really remarkable opportunity, is that it's the marriages themselves that are kind of leading the conversation. The fact that those marriages even happen in the first place. Again, there's a historical piece to this. This was not always the case. I might even mention that the theme of the whole endeavor of the Church in the 21st Century Center this year has to do with the laity, the role of the laity, and I think this is sort of involved in this question. I think of it, I didn't use this image earlier, but I think of it almost as though for a long time the Church gave us training wheels vis-a-vis our relationships, and the training wheels are off. And there's a lot of wobbling right now, that we haven't really gotten straight what it means to be, especially within the Catholic Church, an adult Catholic. So I think that there is an issue that is within the Catholic Church in particular, but I think even, referring back to some of the things that Cindy was observing, it's not unique to Catholics, that being an adult person of faith, even that is, that's a difficult question. So, it's an interest, like I say, it's an interesting point that you raise.
And it's also, I think we came out of a period of time where we had a religion of fear, the fear of consequences. And when you take that away, as if you try to do that with your children, and when they grow up enough so that fear is no longer there, then what happens? You might have a period of rebellion. You might have, you might not have as good a relationship as you would have wanted. But again, it takes some negotiation, some growing pains, if you will. And I think that's the period that we're still in. And we also have, I think, more of a tolerance for other religious traditions. Maybe not in terms of actually knowing how to live together, but at least the idea that they're out there and that they deserve some respect. Obviously, that we can point to other examples where that's not happening at all. But again, as Tim said, I think when you look at the examples of the married couples who are actually living this day to day, they do have an awful lot to teach us. And I think they are shining examples of how to deepen that understanding of what God is and what marriage is, and that symbiotic relationship with God that comes out of a healthy marriage.